Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Mónica Río Nevado de Celaya, soy decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas. El día de hoy voy a compartir con ustedes un recurso pedagógico que utilizamos mucho en clase. Se llama 333 y este consiste en que equipos de 3 personas preparen 3 slides y las presenten en 3 minutos a partir de un problema o una oportunidad que detectan a su alrededor. Deberán encontrar un producto o un servicio que lo pueda resolver y luego el tamaño que tiene ese mercado. Con esto ellos presentan el problema, la solución y el tamaño del mercado. 3 minutos, 3 personas, 3 slides. Los invito a utilizarlo.
Hola, soy Luis Figueroa, profesor del Centro Henry Hazlitt. En clase y en grupos creamos un documento compartido. En él los estudiantes identifican cuáles son los conceptos o palabras clave de cada capítulo, lo integran de acuerdo con el contenido del capítulo y luego de acuerdo con sus experiencias personales. Con esa técnica los estudiantes pueden relacionar por sí mismos, mediante sus ideas y sus experiencias, lo que han leído en los libros con la realidad. Y los invito a usarla.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Javier Comparini Cueto y soy profesor de la Facultad de Derecho. El día de hoy les vengo a presentar una modalidad del aprendizaje basado en simulación. En la modalidad que adoptamos en el curso está dividida en 3 etapas. La primera etapa es la etapa de preparación. En esta primera etapa nosotros grabábamos un video con un colega que simulaba ser un cliente y nos contaba su caso de la vida real. Ese video lo colocábamos en una plataforma que los alumnos en grupo veían y discutían entre ellos para encontrar una solución. La segunda etapa ocurría ya en el salón de clase y en el salón escogíamos en ese momento a uno de todos los grupos que iba a atender al cliente y en esos 20 minutos le daban una asesoría completa e integral para encontrar una solución. Luego pasamos a la tercera etapa, que era la etapa de discusión en grupo y retroalimentación. En esta tercera etapa, los demás grupos que no habían asesorado al cliente le daban su retroalimentación sobre la forma y estrategia que había adoptado el primer grupo y de esta manera también nos permitía discutir entre todos temas del curso mientras desarrollábamos habilidades profesionales importantes. Por eso, el aprendizaje basado en simulación lo que permite es darle a los alumnos la oportunidad de aprender los temas y habilidades necesarias, pero en un contexto de su vida real profesional. Los invitamos a probarlo.
Muy buenas tardes, soy la doctora Lucrecia Anzueto de Hernández, soy la coordinadora del área de Ciencias Básicas. El propósito de esta herramienta que voy a compartir hoy es tener un poquito de retroalimentación sobre qué tan cómodos se sienten los alumnos con el material que tuvieron que revisar antes de llegar a clase. Para cada uno de estos conceptos que pueden ser muy complejos, ¿dónde es donde el alumno necesita un poco de apoyo? La primera diapositiva es cuáles son los resultados de aprendizaje que espero para esa lección. Pido que ellos gradúen y se pongan 0, no entendí nada del material que leí, 5, siento que lo entiendo perfectamente bien y no necesito mayor explicación. Y con ese rango empiezo yo mi clase. Esta escala de 0 a 5 me da una idea de dónde están. Si hay todavía muchos que sienten que no muy lo manejan, 0 a 1, entonces mando un Google Form y entonces les pregunto, ¿usted quisiera que hiciéramos más ejercicios? ¿Usted quisiera ver más ejemplos? ¿Usted quisiera que le volvamos a ver la definición?
Muy buenos días, soy Will y doy clase en el EPRI y a mí como me gusta dar clases, no como las recibí yo en las universidades públicas en España, que era estando 2 horas escuchando a un señor hablar sin parar y todos dormidos en clase. A mí lo que me gusta hacer es hacer una selección de los textos más divertidos y polémicos que van a provocar debate en clase para que los alumnos, habiéndose preparado los textos bien en casa, vengan a la clase realmente a debatir, a seleccionar cuáles son las ideas principales del texto y qué podemos aprender de ellas, ¿no? Mi función es un poco de ser un alumno un poquito más avanzado que ellos e intentar ayudarles con una especie de luz, muchas veces diciendo cuáles son las interpretaciones clásicas que se han dado a estos textos, cuáles son las ideas principales, pero luego es la función de los alumnos ver por qué son realmente relevantes estos textos e ideas principales que ellos tienen y muchas veces pues yo aprendo mucho de ellos porque ven una visión de esas lecturas que yo hasta ahora no había visto y además cada clase, cada generación viene muchas veces con ideas distintas, así que eso para mí es muy interesante. Y siempre les digo que los clásicos son clásicos, como decía Ortega, no por las soluciones que nos dan, sino porque plantean problemas que muchas veces parece que son eternos, ¿no? ¿Cuál es la libertad? ¿Cuál es la función del individuo en la sociedad? ¿Qué es el poder y por qué es tan peligroso? Y todas estas cosas, aunque las soluciones vayamos mejorándolas poco a poco, pues los problemas son eternos y creo que esto hace una clase divertida, ¿no?
Buenos días, mi nombre es María del Pilar Bonilla, yo soy profesora aquí en la Universidad Francisco Marroquín. Hoy quiero compartirles una herramienta pedagógica que es muy útil para las clases, sobre todo porque aquí en la Universidad Francisco Marroquín tratamos de promover las metodologías activas. Estas son metodologías en las cuales el estudiante cobra mayor protagonismo para ser él el verdadero artífice de su proceso de aprendizaje. Pero para que esto funcione necesitamos que el estudiante participe en clase. Y una de las herramientas que utilizo yo muchísimo en clase para promover la participación de los estudiantes es que al inicio de la clase más o menos se invierten entre 2 y no más de 5 minutos, se hace una actividad usualmente fuera de los temas de clase que lo que busca es que todos los estudiantes hablen. La actividad lo que busca es hacer una pregunta, promover una noticia, puede ser incluso un tema no relacionado con la clase, algo que está ocurriendo culturalmente, algo relacionado con los deportes. Pero lo que busca es que todos los estudiantes hablen. Es increíble cómo una vez todos los estudiantes han hablado durante los primeros 5 minutos de clase, se promueve muchísimo la participación el resto de la sesión, donde ya obviamente estás discutiendo los temas en clase. Así que los invito a que inviertan 2 o 3 minutos en actividades o en preguntas o en noticias fáciles, de interés y que promuevan incluso la discusión entre ellos para que todos puedan hablar y se sientan más relajados y así todos participen más en su proceso de aprendizaje. Muchas gracias.
Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Ronald Flores, soy el director del Departamento de Educación y profesor acá en la Universidad Francisco Marroquín. El día de hoy les estaré hablando de una de mis técnicas favoritas para el aprendizaje y es la bitácora. El propósito de la bitácora es registrar todos los aprendizajes que son pertinentes al tema de la clase en un solo lugar. La bitácora es una herramienta que le permite al estudiante mucha libertad y esa es la razón por la cual a mí me gusta usarla. Hay personas que registran su pensamiento, hay personas que hacen esquemas, que hacen diagramas, que hacen dibujos, que incluyen fotografía. La bitácora no necesariamente tiene que ser un cuaderno de apuntes, puede ser un blog, puede ser un videoblog, puede ser un audioblog, pero lo importante es que esté centralizada en un solo lugar y que la persona, según su estilo de aprendizaje, la alimente constantemente con todas aquellas lecturas, visualizaciones de audiovisuales, películas, series, conversaciones, exposiciones en museos o cosas de la vida cotidiana que le motive una reflexión y o un aprendizaje. Las personas que cultivan la bitácora durante la clase pueden hacerlo después de la clase, agrupando ahí todas las enseñanzas que tienen acerca de este tema. Por ejemplo, hacemos una bitácora en la clase de grandes conversaciones entre la filosofía y el cine. Y esa bitácora se va quedando, acumulando todos estos pensamientos, todas estas ideas dispersas, todos estos esquemas, de tal forma que puede ser una herramienta de aprendizaje que le sirva al estudiante mucho más allá de su vida académica estudiantil. Puede ser un compañero de aprendizaje de por vida. Te exhorto a que le des un intento y pruebes esta herramienta.
Hola, mi nombre es Lourdes Corado, soy la directora del Departamento de Psicología y les quiero compartir esta técnica que uso en el aula para alimentar y activar la metacognición de nuestros estudiantes. La metacognición es la destreza de pensar sobre cómo pienso y es muy simple. En las mañanas, cuando hago el quiz de comprobación de lectura, en lugar de formular yo las preguntas, le pido a 3 estudiantes que cada uno formule una pregunta para sus compañeros. Ese ejercicio de pensar en qué preguntar está alimentando esa destreza de reflexionar sobre qué es lo que yo he aprendido de esta lectura. Así es que los animo a poner en práctica este recurso de estímulo metacognitivo para sus estudiantes en el aula, donde la improvisación les anima mucho.
Hola a todos, soy Robert Quevedo, soy el decano de la Facultad de Arquitectura. les voy a compartir una herramienta que utilizamos afuera de clase para poder de alguna manera ir aterrizando los conceptos que vemos en clase. Pues básicamente lo que hacemos es que utilizamos un grupo privado de Facebook en donde los alumnos suben artículos, videos, noticias que están sucediendo en ese momento y de alguna manera lo atan al contenido que vemos en clase. Entonces, básicamente toman los conceptos que vemos en clase y buscan tener una idea más clara de cómo estos se ven en la realidad, en el mundo en que están viviendo. Entonces, este formato lo que nos permite es entablar una discusión, entablar algún tipo de debate, poder ver los puntos a favor y en contra y que entre ellos puedan discutir y ver los diferentes puntos de vista que cada uno tiene y cómo la teoría se ve en la práctica. Así que los animo a utilizar esta herramienta.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's a great honor to see you guys in person and to have Barbara Oakley here in person too. Make it an extra awesome. So thank you so much for being here. And we're just really happy to see all of you, people from different departments at the university, people from different universities and from school. Welcome to UFM, and welcome, Barbara, to UFM. And as I was thinking about what can I say about Barbara Oakley, because you all know her. So I was just thinking about this time when I was in college and I had to interview her. And this was just an interview not to be recorded or anything. It was just me trying to learn from you. And I had all these questions for you, and I was asking you, what advice would you give me? And you were saying, well, what would you want to do, or what would you like to learn next? And how do you think you can learn that? What has worked for you before? So my big takeaway was like, wow, you're a great learner. Clearly teaching people how to learn. I should have known that before. But you were asking all those great questions too, and really making me think for myself. So I remember that, and I really appreciate it. And the other thing is, you basically dedicated your life to to teaching people about how we learn and to make neuroscience easier for people through metaphors and through stories. And I think that's very valuable, especially changing people's mindsets when somebody can think, I'm not good at math or I'm not good at numbers, but really thinking about how they could learn about it and how they can, once they learn about it and understand it, actually like it and enjoy it. So thank you for that. And your newest book is great. And the book is also great. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's such an honor, Carmen. And we've known each other, 5 years, 6 years now? I knew her since she was little. But I think it's kind of no fair, because you're sitting there with the book and all those notes, and I don't have anything. So I guess I have to remember things. But I remember that conversation very well. Even then, you were asking such good questions yourself about learning and what learning what's involved in learning. But I think knowing about learning and how to learn effectively, it also helps you to approach life in a much more balanced way. So you're able to look more fairly at what's going on and be able to flexibly change when you should be changing, and staunch perhaps sometimes when you shouldn't be changing. So I think that learning is at the heart of everything we are as human beings. And so it's really a pleasure to share here at UFM, because I think it's really at the heart of what we as a civilization need to be learning. And I love the approaches you take here.
Thank you, Barbara. And that talking about questions, I'm reminded that you can all ask questions through Slido. So there's, if you're online, you'll see the QR code right now, or if you're here, you can also see it on the screens. Thank you for that. So just scan that QR code, just like you would do at some restaurant to get the menu, and you'll log into Slido and be able to ask questions and also upvote other people's questions. But yeah, our first question is, what got you into researching about teaching? Because you had written books about learning in general. What made you research and write this book and also create the MOOC on Uncommon Sense Teaching as to help teachers help students learn?
It's funny, when I first did the massive open online course, Learning How to Learn, that came out in 2014. And people asked me at the time, could you do a course on teaching? And I thought, no, I can't. I mean, it's enough just learning how to learn. I mean, I can't teach teachers how to teach. But the more I got around the world of learning, and particularly around the world of education, I began to realize that many common sense ideas about how people learn effectively are actually very ineffective. So I thought, maybe I should try to work with a team to put together a book about not the common sense findings about how people learn effectively, but the uncommon sense, the counterintuitive ideas about effective learning that can really make a great teacher, and that great teachers sometimes do automatically, but that a lot of people can benefit from learning. So I remember when I was speaking with my co-author, Beth Rogowski, she was a K-12 educator for 15 years, and she did a postdoc at Rutgers and then became a professor of pedagogy. So I said to Beth, we should write a book together, with my friend Terry Sanowski, and we should call it Common Sense Teaching. Oh my gosh, she lit into me. She's like, you have no idea. Things that people think are common sense are often just really wrong, but everybody keeps doing them. And I keep seeing the same mistakes made in the classroom today that were being made 20 years ago when I first started. So that's where the book on Common Sense Teaching came from. But I think a lot of books that bring in neuroscience often end up, it's like, and this is your amygdala. Don't let the amygdala get scared because your students can't learn as well. It's like every single book on the neuroscience of learning, it all goes back to the amygdala. And yet that's just the tiniest part of what you really could be taking from neuroscience to help improve your teaching. So we really were determined to look at and bring out fresh, practically useful ideas from neuroscience. And really, it's just the tip of the iceberg, because so then after this, we did MOOC 1, the first online course for Uncommon Sense Teaching. Now I'm working on the scripts for the second MOOC, and I'm like, oh, we didn't cover this. Oh, but this is really useful. We've got to get this. So when you watch the online course, as opposed to reading the book, you will find really complementary, but a lot of very different material being covered between them.
As you were learning about neuroscience and also teaching, did you have any aha moments, or what were some important takeaways that you started, or things that you stopped doing or started doing because of what you were learning about neuroscience as you were teaching?
So, well, I think to dive more deeply into that question, I should just bring up a problem that had been bothering me for decades, like for close to 50 years. And that was when I learned to learn a language at the Defense Language Institute. I studied the wrong language. I studied Russian, not Spanish. But that was one of the world's best places. They really had the science of learning a language down very well. And I used that to learn Russian. And then later, so it was, 5 years later, I was trying to learn in math and science, and I used the same approaches that I had used at the Defense Language Institute, that they had taught me to learn a language. And those same approaches worked in learning in math and science. And for decades, I've been like, why? What is going on in the brain that I could learn something so completely different, but yet there's something going on, I can feel it inside me neurally, that my learning in language was really quite similar, and I used the same approaches. So it was actually in studying Professor Michael Ullman's Declarative Procedural Language Learning Theory. Is that a boring name for a theory? But I was reading his theories, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is the golden, this is what I've been looking for all these years, because he could show how we have two different learning systems, declarative through the hippocampus, procedural through the basal ganglia, And that when you learn something so well that it becomes habitual, which is how we learn our native language, you can do it without even thinking about it. And it was those approaches, that procedural learning, that I applied when I was learning in math and science. So I would practice with problems so that, I could look at any problem, and I am not a natural. It's not like Terry Sanowski, my brilliant compadre. He could look at an equation and go, oh, well, yeah, you just take that, okay, and then the derivative here, and oh, yeah, and then take an integral, and then, and he'd have it solved like instantly. For me, I'd have to practice with ideas. But when I practice a lot, so I could look at a problem and the solution to the problem would flow like a song through my mind. And I had learned it procedurally. The procedural system is where you get that intuition. It's the intuition you use when you speak your native language, and the words emerge without you having to consciously think about it. So if you use these two different systems, and as it turns out, okay, so small digression into history. So Lenore will go a little bit historically speaking. So back in the 1950s, and this is actually really super relevant to today, there were two gigantic people related to the field of psychology. One was an actual psychologist, B.F. Skinner, so you probably have heard of him. B.F. Skinner was the guy behind behaviorist approaches to learning. So you teach a chicken to peck on something and they get a little pellet in return. It's very simple, you see a stimulus, you get a reward. So this MIT linguist named Noam Chomsky, you may have heard the name, said, this is stupid. People can't really learn things. This is like the most, it's like primordial forms of learning. People could never learn a language through a simple stimulus response. And he wrote this entire paper in a very prestigious linguistics journal in the late 1950s. And then right around 1970, he wrote a big article in the New Yorker that just eviscerated B.F. Skinner and said his work is the stupidest work you can. He just demeaned B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner, on the other hand, could be a jerk himself. So what B.F. Skinner did was he believed that you could not study anything you couldn't see or analyze or actually get into and look at. So you couldn't study the brain, you could only study the input and the output of the brain. You can't actually study the brain because you can't see what's going on inside it. At that time, you couldn't see what was going on inside it. And some people would try to convince B.F. Skinner that, hey, we can't see electrons. So do we say that electrons don't exist? There's some stuff we just assume that things are happening. But B.F. Skinner was very staunch, inflexible in his beliefs. And so he was an easy guy to hate because, anybody that came up with cognitive theories about how the brain was actually working, he was like, no, can't go there, can't publish on that because you can't, see inside the brain to actually see whether it's true. So when Chomsky attacked Skinner, there was a ready audience for people who were just waiting to hate on Skinner. But now, when we look back, here's the upshot. Chomsky was dead wrong. Skinner was right. And what Chomsky did was he set, for example, learning in artificial intelligence back by decades by this, he wouldn't actually engage with the merits of the argument. He would just demean Skinner. And so everybody got to think that, hey, Chomsky's the be all and end all, and of course we can't learn language by just simple stimulus response. Actually, that's how we learn language, as we now know. But it got deeper than that. People started to demean the idea of any kind of memorization or rote learning because Chomsky said it was just non-thinking. And it was just simple rote stuff. We can't actually learn that way. And so it kind of became the cognitive revolution was, you could say in part that the mantra of the cognitive revolution was, you can always look it up. You don't need to remember anything. Well, that's actually not true because you need neural structures. You need to remember things. Learning itself is, you have to have the memories in your brain, otherwise you haven't learned it. So artificial intelligence has begun to flourish only because people have begin to come out from under the spell of Noam Chomsky, Marvin Minsky, and others who have disparaged behaviorist approaches. Now, the real problem was that the brain's learning, it's not simple feedback. It's actually multiple levels of feedback. That's the complexity that was needed. But since all research in that area was stifled, we didn't make any progress, and we made no progress in artificial intelligence for many, many decades. So for me, I think one of the most important things in uncommon sense teaching is the discussion of the procedural system, which is in chapter 6, and how important that system, it has always in the past been demeaned as, that's just the source of rote learning. Yeah, it's rote learning, but it's also how we learn incredibly complicated patterns, like how you learn a language. So, it's that chapter 6 is an attempt to push back at modern approaches to education, which include ideas such as, you don't need to remember anything, you can always just look it up. And some of these approaches actually cripple students' abilities to learn. And I'll give you an example. So we recently had we had a position open. We had maybe 150 applicants for that position in engineering. Of those applicants, I would say 5% were educated in a typical reform mathematics American system educational system. The other 95% were all from the countries where their educational systems are disparaged by reform mathematics educators. So, in fact, the few applicants, it's quite crystal clear that the approach being used by reform educators, especially in mathematics, is actually crippling students' abilities to learn. And the more that countries can kind of step back into the future and use more especially their more traditional approaches to learning, oftentimes it's really valuable. When I'm speaking in India and I say, you know what? Some rote memorization is a good thing to have had. And they're like, oh, this is the first time anyone's ever told us that all our rote learning actually had some benefit to it. And, all my colleagues are from, countries like India or the Middle East or China, and they're really, really good because of those ways that they're educated. I tend to think if we can marry the best of both Eastern and Western approaches to education in helping build both some good procedural knowledge of the world, but also good declarative understanding that's more flexible, using metaphors and so forth. That will also help people be more creative learners. So to my mind, the best of all education is a melding of both East and West, and that's what we've tried to convey with our book on common sense teaching.
And that really resonates with me because I remember when I was in high school, all of a sudden we had this movement or no more homework for math or for anything because we can use a calculator and we can just Google stuff. We can look up facts. We don't need to learn them anymore. And then when I was in college, I had this teacher telling me, yes, you have to know something so you can be creative. You need to have something in your brain so that you can actually connect ideas and create new stuff. So I remember that being an aha moment when I was like, oh yeah, even though I can look up stuff, I should also be trying to learn quote unquote facts or this procedural learning or doing drills or rote practice just to get better at something. And related to that, somebody's asking, Nixon is asking a question. He's asking, what would you say to a 10-year-old student? What advice would you give to a younger learner or just to college age learners too? What advice would you give them?
Oh, well, I'd say to watch my online courses.
I agree.
And the thing is, you know, you can't just sit here and go, oh, okay, I want you to sleep more. Be sure to practice and drill with things. You know, I mean, it's the same old thing that everybody hears, but unless you hear the sort of what's happening in your brain, you know, that makes the learning happen and that kind of gets you excited. I mean, kids love to ride a bicycle in general. Why? I mean, it hurts to learn to ride a bicycle. You know, you're falling down, you get scrapes, maybe a broken arm or something like that. But kids can see the ultimate, you know, what's going to happen. They're going to be able to kind of fly along just like their older sister or brother, and it's really exciting. So they are willing to go through the pain of learning. But for much of learning is like a mental sport. And it's harder to see. It's not like you can see your brothers and sisters, you know, riding along. Doing math doesn't seem, you can't see the immediate payoff or the beauty of it. So if you can have something that's kind of encouraging about both how to learn and why to learn, that can help so that when students are faced with learning something new, they've got a little bit more by way of intellectual tools that they can use to help grapple with it. The best way to make learning easier, to help to make a student more motivated, is to teach them a little bit about the stuff. The more you learn about something, the easier it is to start sticking new information into the brain. So of course, as a teacher, your own enthusiasm can be infectious. And it's really important, I think, for younger students, especially to see face-to-face and see that excitement that you have. So a little aside. So in the US, there's a chef named Guy Fieri who has this television show, and he goes off to rural restaurants and he introduces you to their recipes and the restaurant itself. So he usually comes out when they're going to film a restaurant. He comes out about 2 weeks beforehand, and he is just like this normal person. Hello, how are you? He's looking at the stuff. He talks to everything. Then 2 weeks later, he comes back for filming, and he is Guy Fieri. He's totally on fire, the wild hair, and he's bigger than life, way bigger than life. And we forget sometimes that as teachers, we kind of need to do that same sort of thing. We need to be bigger than life, bigger than that. And some of us, we know, many of us know that. That's why when we teach and we're done for the day, we're just like, because you've actually been bigger than life. You're not, you know, you're more outgoing and more exciting and vibrant. Like you'll see me tonight, I'll be like, okay, well, you know, I'll just be a total dud. But you want to be bigger than life, especially when you're online, because you lose about 10 charisma points for every, you know, for anything that you're filming online. And so you got to be up and bigger than life and share that enthusiasm. That will help motivate. Learning the material itself will help motivate. I have to tell you about our two daughters. So I'm sure you've heard the term tiger mom. I mean, I wish I could be a tiger mom, but I'm like too laid back. So I'm a tiger mom with one paw. So what I decided was I got one thing that I could make our kids do, whether they liked it or not. So I took them to dance, and I took them to, music lessons and sports, and they'll never forgive me for basketball. I took them to all these things. They didn't care. They didn't want to do it. But the one thing that I got to make them do was an extra 20 minutes a day of practice with math. So we did that most days for about 10 years. Now, our older daughter, she was like super pathetic with math. I mean, she was like, okay, we got one finger here. He's Mr. Hand, and got two fingers on him now. How many fingers are there on Mr. Hand? I mean, I'm exaggerating maybe a little bit. Math did not come easy for her. And that extra practice was invaluable. She would have been one of those kids that's like, I just can't learn math. Instead, she just finished her medical residency at Stanford. And I can tell you for sure that without that extra practice in math that opens all career doors, she would not have had that available for her. But what about our second daughter, our artist, right? Hated math, 10 years of struggle, making, it's like my thing. I get one thing, it's 20 minutes of extra math most days. So 10 years of struggle, trying to figure out some way to reward her and get her to do something one day, okay? She goes off, gets her degree in art, and she goes out as an artist. And then she goes to the real world, and she finds out what it's all about. And now she's just finishing her master's in statistics, and she loves math. So even when you think that you're not doing anything for the children you're teaching, maybe over a long time, you can be making enormous differences that can help them to really have a great grounding in life later on. So just don't despair. It's this bit by bit. You can't really see necessarily the upshot of what you're doing, but as teachers, what you're doing is so important. So just, keep it up, keep your spirits high, because it really, really does make a difference for kids.
That's related to one of the questions that Luis is asking on Slido. So he's asking if you have any advice for when students don't want to learn something that's not necessarily related to their passion or what they're currently studying. For instance, if I'm studying art, why should I learn about math?
So this is where teacherly wiles come in handy. There's no one formula. I remember when I was in 11th grade and I was flunking chemistry, and my teachers or my parents were like, "You're flunking chemistry." And I was like, "Yeah, so what?" And so they sent me to Mr. Fry so that Mr. Fry could help tutor me. I remember sitting in front of Mr. Fry, and it was as if I was going like this. Okay, buddy, come on, see if you can put something in my brain, because I can guarantee you it's not going to go in there. I mean, I was like the worst student you ever could have. You can never reach all students because, there's sometimes going to be at a place, at a time, or, that it's just not right for them. But if you're reaching, the majority, 90% of your students, and a lot of times, and you can't do this, like if you have some enormous class, you can't do so much. But if you can find ways to help that student to come at it, whatever you're teaching, from their own place, you can really help them to, to actually get enthusiastic about it. You being interested in them as a person can help them get interested in what you're trying to teach. And I think we as teachers often know that. It can just be a little draining because you can only do, give of yourself to so many people. But if you can find ways to, to make it relevant for the person you're teaching, and also just get over that first initial hump of it's harder because you're first starting with something. There's a concept called neural schemas. And in essence, it's this connected network of neurons that you gain as a result of gaining expertise in something. The best way to enhance a schema is to just have a schema in the first place. In other words, get those basic ideas in your brain, not that you go look them up, and then you can much more easily, it's kind of like if you've already got a building structure, it's easier to put something on the structure because it's already there. So in fact, a very, very good way to motivate students is just to get them however you can through those initial steps. Share your enthusiasm, kind of come at them from their place if you need to, get them past this initial hurdle. That will gain, especially if you can help them gain procedural system fluency, it will start seeming easier what they're doing, and they'll be more excited and interested about learning it.
And there's one video on the MOOC where Beth is dressed as a magician, and she's saying, wouldn't it be awesome if just like with a magic wand, we could make our students be as interested in our subjects as we are on the subjects that we're teaching. And then you also recommend on the MOOC that we should focus on the learning process itself. And I don't know if you use the word falling in love or the term falling in love, but I'm guessing if you fall in love with the process of learning, and if you get used to struggling through those initial stages of when you're learning something new, then that will also make it better for you when you're learning anything else.
Carmen, that's such a perceptive comment. Because in some sense, you really can fall in love with the process of learning. And what I mean by that is, so your brain releases dopamine, and it makes you feel good. That's why people get addicted to drugs, because as artificial dopamine enhancing mechanisms work really well. But it makes you feel good. And so learning itself can make you feel good because learning involves, you only learn something because there's little tiny dollops of dopamine that release in your brain. Mice, they have their dopamine systems disabled, can't learn anything new. And what happens is, like, if you can just get yourself or get students to get a little bit curious about something, just a little curious. Well, if they start trying to solve a problem and they're a little curious about it, well, they'll try some approach. Yeah, it doesn't work. Another one doesn't work. Another one doesn't work. Oh, wait a minute. Unexpectedly, I solved this problem. What happens is little squirts of what's called phasic dopamine squirt out right in the synapses of the trail. It's kind of like Hansel and Gretel and that little trail squirts out right along that trail, and that enhances that neural pathway, and voila, you've just learned something. So curiosity and sparking curiosity in your learners is a really good way to help students learn. So, for example, in the massive open online course, Learning How to Learn, the first thing we did, or I always tried to make it so the beginning of each video has some sort of a hook. Something that makes you curious or makes you laugh or something. And what that does is you get hooked, then I feed you the science of it, and then you get that, because you're hooked, you got that hook set, then you're more receptive to the science that you're learning about. And then at the end, when you learn what resolves the hook, you get this aha, and everything you've just learned just gets reinforced because dopamine gets squirted out there. So oftentimes, course designers, instructional designers, and even teachers will be taught that the best way for people to learn is, well, all you got to do is tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you've told them. But that's about the worst way to get people excited and enthusiastic about learning. And the thing is, people think that if they just know the material, that they can teach it, and that's enough. But actually, it takes time to come up with a good hook and a completely different sensibility than your subject matter. For example, if I'm teaching about static and dynamic friction, what's a good hook? I mean, that's kind of a boring well, I knew this guy in Antarctica who was killed because he didn't know the difference between static and dynamic friction. Now you've got them hooked. What is that difference between static and dynamic friction? So actually in my classes, lots of people end up dying. So they can be a little morbid, but they make for really good stories.
That makes a lot of sense, because in the book and in the MOOC, you also talk about the importance of scaffolding and of designing, because often, and I've done that myself, where I think, I'm just going to teach to the students who really want to learn and who already love the subject. And the other ones can just, figure it out themselves, or maybe learn about it later. Maybe it's not the time for them to learn about this subject now. Maybe later they will become interested in this subject. It's not their moment. But that's a terrible thing to do. And as you say in the MOOC, we should be designing for the best students, but we should also be scaffolding and providing support for the other students who might not be the ones who are passionate about that subject area at the moment, or who are struggling to learn about it because they might become really good at it. So how can we support those people? And first of all, how can we hook them into actually wanting to learn about that subject? So what are some good hooks, or what are elements of good hooks that we can use when we're teaching?
So of course there's myriad of answers. That's why the whole book is there. But I just remember, a big thing to me is that slower learners are just as important as fast learners. And indeed, we have seen that. Hayek himself wrote, the Nobel Prize winner, wrote that he was a very slow learner, and that was what allowed him to be successful. Because he was so slow, because he forgot things, and he'd be by all these people who were super smart, they could learn really fast, they could remember all these things, and he was not able to do that. He'd have to, learn, forget, wake up the next day, have to relearn. But because he did this, he could find all these little assumptions that the super fast learners made that were wrong. And he could, that's why he got the Nobel Prize, was because he was really thinking. So slow learners are really important, and they're important even from an evolutionary perspective. If you look at groups of fish or flocks of birds, they will have a mixture, because fast learners sound great, right? Fast learners can be inaccurate and inflexible. They learn really quickly, but they can be wrong in their learning, and then they can't change. Slow learners, they're slow, but they can be much more accurate and much more flexible. So sometimes I wonder that when we take, universities and we have professors, and what do we select professors for? Fast learners. They're very fast, but they can be very inaccurate and very inflexible. And we can see that in the history of science, where one recent paper found that indeed science does progress funeral by funeral, because these top-notch scientists simply cannot change. If somebody comes up with a different theory, it's against their own, it doesn't matter how great, the evidence is, they'll find some way to intellectually justify why they must have been right. One thing that really stuck in my mind was I was speaking in Singapore, and I was talking to a very highly placed government official in learning. And I was talking about the importance of helping slow learners as well as fast learners, because they give a differing and really important set of ideas for us. And I remember the kind of the look of derision on her face. It was like, if you're not fast, I don't even want to help these learners. And it was a kind of the epitome of what I was trying to get at, which was this idea that slow learning is also very important. It can be as good or even better, but she was so deeply convinced that fast learning was the only kind of learning that she simply could not even see that we would need to bring slow learners along. And she was one of the key people in education. So I do think there's been far too long, there's been this tendency to kind of, if you're not one of the fast learners, you kind of get written out and you don't get as much attention from the teachers. But it's, what is it they say? The A students end up working for the C students. Why is that? It's partly because the really fast learners aren't necessarily the most accurate in what they're thinking about, not the most strategic. And there's good evidence from business and studies that slower CEOs that are slower to make their decisions can be much more strategic. So I think one thing I was really trying to do was give techniques in the book and in the course. How do you help students who are slower to still be able to keep up? So for me, I count myself as a slower learner, and I really am. So I would meet my fellow engineers, they'd be taking 5 engineering courses. They're like, it took me 2 hours to solve that problem. And I'm like, 2 hours? I was working on that problem for 3 days. Sometimes it was just really hard. But at the same time, there are ways to help both kinds of learners like me. And I do just as well on tests and everything. It just takes me longer to get the same ideas. So breaking things up into smaller pieces, it's a pretty standard technique for scaffolding. So let's say that I take one of my brilliant colleagues and they're teaching. What they do is, well, just take this, and then you just take the derivative and it's all done. And it's like too much at once. By breaking things into understandable chunks, you can make things clearer whether someone's a fast learner or a slow learner. A good tip, if you're a teacher who is a slow learner and you're masking it, whenever you get asked a question that you can't figure out because you're not a fast learner, just ask a fast learner in your class. And it works really well to hide the fact that it takes you a little bit more time sometimes to figure out these really, really tough questions that very fast thinkers can devise. Fast learners often have very large working memories. They can hold a lot of information in mind at once. So you're conscious of, let's say that you asked me 5 questions at one, asked me if I could remember maybe 2 of them because I don't have a big working memory. Some people, you can ask them 5 questions at once, or you could, they could play 10 simultaneous games of chess with people, and they have such a prodigious working memory, they can hold a lot. So you want to, for the person with the lesser working memory capacity, they can still learn just as well. But again, breaking things up into bits and also giving them extra opportunities for practice. That gives their procedural systems something to really, so they really learn it and then they don't have to think about it. That's your habitual system. So more practice for those with lesser capacity working memory works really, really well. And there's more tips. So if you just look in the book or online, and the course I should mention is free. So, and it's not like free, but with an upsell. I suppose there's an upsell in that if you want to get a certificate, you can do that, but you don't need a certificate, and you get all of the tests, all of the videos. And boy, did we ever pour our heart out in those videos. I think they're hysterically funny, even as they're also teaching something that is often quite novel and really practically useful.
Yes, and something that I took away from the MOOC and the book was you always hear how it's great to have diverse classrooms where you have students who can learn really fast. You call them race car drivers, and students who are hikers or take longer time to learn something. And you always hear, and everyone says, it's great to have diverse classrooms and to have all kinds of learners in the classroom. But when I was teaching at a school, I remember parents were concerned, like, oh, my kid is gifted. Like, why should my kid be learning with all this, with these hiker students? And reading this really, like, something clicked for me where a race car driver can still, as he or she keeps practicing more, they can learn better and put more stuff into their long-term memory. So doing more practice is good for both hikers and race car drivers. So that was a big aha moment for me reading it.
It is good, although race car learners often need less practice. So the hiker may have to go home and practice more. But even so, I think the most important thing when we have, so there's a big movement, for example, in California to like get away from anything for gifted students and to say that there are no such things as gifted students. And I think that's an outright denial of, decades of what we've learned from neuroscience about some people are just gifted, and they're gifted writers, they're gifted at mathematics. It's okay. We can use these students, as they mature to help us learn new things in new areas. But at the same time, we shouldn't expect, sometimes there's an approach to learning called constructivism, where you kind of turn students loose with the materials and expect them to figure it out for themselves. Now, if you talk to a constructivist, they'll be like, oh no, we don't do that. But the reality is if you go into actual classrooms, that's frequently how constructivism, constructivist approaches are taught. And because teachers are really busy, and they'd like to just turn students loose, let them learn it, and while they're grading other things or doing something different. But the reality is that if you want students to learn effectively, the best way is direct instruction, and that means giving them a little bit of explicit instruction, allowing them to practice with the materials, then you give them a little more and practice and so forth. This is naturally what good teachers have done for centuries. And it should be no surprise that it's actually a very, but it is a surprise for most teachers, for example, in the US, they've never heard of direct instruction, or if they've heard of it, they haven't heard of what it actually is. They think it's the same as lecture. But direct instruction is this interspersed, and it was carefully studied in one of the largest studies ever done in education of hundreds of thousands of children over 9 years. And they were studying something like 10 different techniques for teaching, including methods of raising self-esteem, constructivist approaches, and so forth. Direct instruction was one of those techniques. It came out at the end so far ahead of all of the other techniques studied that they buried the research and never published it. And if you think about it, look, there's the 9 other approaches, and they're all like not even in the ballpark as far as learning, compared with direct instruction. So it's 9 against 1, and so they buried it. And remember, that was a time frame when Noam Chomsky was reigning supreme. And part of what these direct instruction approaches involve is practice and actually some, rote memorization and so forth. I mean, that wasn't an anathema. So it's a little like, you may wonder, Mendel came out with, he made his tremendous discoveries about, that laid the basis for our modern understanding of genetics, but they languished for like 50 years because they didn't fit the zeitgeist. And so it's similar, I think, in education now. I think we're finally at a point where we can start changing and pivoting and showing that direct instruction really is very good, even if it was first discovered 50 years ago and then subsequently buried and hidden and not taught in schools of pedagogy. So that's part of what we're trying to do as well with this book and the MOOC, is to bring to teachers' attention that they have this powerful teaching tool and they're probably already doing at least parts of it. And I think it's just a wonderful thing for people to know.
Tono is asking, what would you modify or change to make work or classwork better for a hiker who might be less self-driven than a race car driver?
Oh,
And yeah, just one question at a time. So let's just.
okay.
It's not overwhelmed.
Oh, okay. So the question was, what can we do to make classrooms more welcoming for hikers? Is that?
What could we modify so that people who are less self-driven towards learning can learn as much as a race car who might be more driven to learn about a specific subject?
So part of the challenge is that we're not there yet with neuroscience for all students. There are so it all goes back to your ability to focus your attention on something. If someone doesn't quite have a really well-tuned focusing system, it's very difficult for them to focus on something. So it's hard to motivate a student who finds it really difficult to pay attention to you or to want to pay attention to you. Also, if you have a lesser capacity working memory, it can be really, school itself can turn into kind of a really not a very friendly experience. So I think that, well, one time they did a study and they were trying to figure out that from this one school, by comparison with other schools, that there seemed to be these students that would come out and despite all odds, it was a really, they were growing up in a horrific environment, in the slums, and it was very hard, but this one area seemed to be turning out these students who did really, really well in their lives. So they went back and they were analyzing, and they finally found that there was one common factor to these really, highly high-performing individuals who'd come through great hardship, and it was a first-grade teacher. One first-grade teacher in this one school, and she had this way of getting her students to believe that they were kind of a special team together. And in their lives, their lives were going to, they were going to be helping, and that there was something greater than themselves that they were created for. If you actually go and look at gaming theory, one of the biggest things that a gaming theory says is, you have a bigger than life quest that you are being put on. And this teacher was able to motivate even many of these unmotivatable students by helping them to feel like they are in a quest together, in something that's bigger than life. So I think if we can do that, and I mean, the reality is what is happening here at UFM really is bigger than life. I mean, I love being part of this team because it is something that I think is important for society as a whole. So, so as teachers, the more we can, impart in our students this idea of you're special and you're involved in something bigger than yourself, the more that your students can thrive and be motivated even if they have attentional difficulties.
That's really beautiful. And also with collaborative learning and how sometimes I remember not wanting to do the reading for class. And then I would immediately think, okay, all of my peers are doing the reading and they're also probably not sleeping enough, or they're also tired and they're still doing it. So I need to do it myself. So that's like nice peer pressure also helps. And a question that I had too is like, when you want to move students from more direct instruction to more student-directed learning, that's the ultimate goal. You want the student to be independent, self-reliant, and be able to do things on his or her own. How can we help hikers or students who are more prone to need more instruction, and how can we make sure that they actually get to a more independent stage? Because if we want to live in a society of free and responsible people, we really need to be helping people, helping everyone, or as much people as we can go through that stage where they can be more independent and self-reliant.
That's such a good question. I think it happens by the questions we ask our students. We can ask low-level questions. Do you know these facts? Are you comfortable with using this problem-solving technique? And we can also build on that to ask bigger questions. One thing I see, for example, at UFM is UFM involves the students in big picture planning about the future. Most other universities I know just don't do that. So it's the kind of questions you ask of students, the kind of situations you get them in. We don't, as teachers, just need to ask, do you have this bit of knowledge? But also, how we can ask questions that help them grow with the knowledge.
Thank you. And one thing, so a week ago, or maybe it was this week, I don't really remember, but we have an event that's called Teacher Tuesday. And it's once a month where we meet with teachers and we talk about different challenges that we're facing in the classrooms, and we share challenges and good practices of things that have worked well. And for this Teacher Tuesday, we had the students give us presentations and share with us about what had been challenging and what had worked well for them as they were learning in this hybrid environment during this semester. And there was this debate about one student who liked to do more tests and to practice recalling. And then there were other students who were saying that, no, we don't want to do tests and it's not fun to do them. Then I was looking at the book and you recommend, okay, like low stakes testing so the students can practice recalling so that we can make sure that we actually have information in our long-term memories. So what would you say to students or teachers who are, and there was a question about, what do you think about tests and exams? So.
Well, there's, this is so much. So, Bob Bjork, the UCLA researcher on learning, has pointed out the importance of deliberate practice. And that means focusing on the most painful and most difficult parts of learning. And it really, I mean, I work with a company called Course Hero, and they supply testing materials or, have them available. And they did a massive survey on what learners' concerns, students' concerns were. And the biggest thing that came out of all of this survey and evaluation of tens of thousands of students, number one, learning is hard. And I think sometimes we want to take the easy way out. You know, I mean, I know I do. I would rather reread something a whole bunch of times than sit there and try to retrieve it from my brain. It's harder to do that. But I think trying to explain to students some of what happens when you retrieve information from your brain, you're strengthening those connections, that if you just, just read over the material, you're actually wasting your time in some sense. So you can put in all this study, but if you're not using effective techniques, you're actually just making it a waste of time, study time. So I think teaching students about how their brain actually learns, it's so funny. Schools almost never teach two things. They don't teach you how to learn, and they don't teach personal finance. So, and you can, the curmudgeon in me says, well, let's see, they don't want to teach how to learn because that will maybe take them less out of the picture more as teachers. And they don't want to teach about personal finance because then you might look more carefully at what college is actually giving you. So that's the curmudgeon parts of me. But, those are kind of my thoughts on it.
I remember when I was in college in my freshman year and I was reading a book and we were supposed to write journal about, either write a summary or I can't remember what the exact assignment was, but we had to write something about every chapter or every thing that we were reading before a dialogue and then after a dialogue. And when I didn't do that on time, when I procrastinated and then waited until a week before it was due, I didn't remember exactly what I had read. So then I always felt like, oh no, like I'm losing that. It was really hard to read that. And I was just about to get it, but I didn't put on that extra effort I didn't put in. And now I need to just basically start from scratch and reread everything and try to learn everything again. So.
When you're learning something, it often seems so totally trivial that night to like review some of the key ideas. Just pull them up into your mind. What were the key things? It's like, well, duh, I know it all. It's so easy. Why should I bother? And so you don't realize how helpful that practice actually can be. Sometimes I would have my students do something I called a 3-minute quiz, which is every time they came to class, at the very beginning of class, I would ask them to put away all their books and I would ask them to retrieve a key equation. So, and maybe do a simple problem with it. So it's like, it's so trivial. Well, but it did several things. Number one, it always got them to class on time, right? 3-minute quiz, right as the class begins, they lose those points. Number two, I could walk around the class and see them put their names on the paper so I could remember their names. But the third thing it did was it day by day helped them to remember the key concept, force them to remember. If they hadn't had those 3-minute quizzes, over the weeks, it would have just become more foreign to them as, things that's trivial until 3 weeks later, you're suddenly looking at all the stuff you've covered over 3 weeks. So just that bit by bit can really be helpful sometimes.
Someone is asking, I'll just read it. It's, several of your ideas overlap with Montessori. How influenced are you by her work? And would you consider her work, even the one with older kids, relevant today? And I just want to add something to that question. You mentioned Montessori in one of the videos, so you should watch the MOOC if you're asking that question, because she mentions her, but I'll let you answer the question.
Okay. So I think Maria Montessori was a brilliant visionary. Our own children were in Montessori when they were young, so they did like kindergarten, first grade with Montessori. The challenge is her approach is really, really good for the procedural learning system. It is not necessarily as good for declarative. And the declarative system is how you learn like advanced mathematics, how you learn a language as an adult, and that kind of thing. So this is why I think, there's always this push of Montessori is great. We should be using the same techniques in college. It's like, come on, good luck with teaching vector calculus using Maria Montessori's techniques. They are awesome for kids who are learning procedurally. They have their place, and that place, I think, is a preeminent place for young children. But the more children mature, the more we also need, some of the more traditional approaches to education, but it depends as well on the child. You can have a kid who's really gifted in math, and I'm telling you, I'm not saying you got to sit there and make that kid learn through the traditional way of learning. A lot of kids are gifted in their own way with certain things. And if they are, then let them flourish with what they're gifted at. But we as a society suffer if we think that we should just let all students just learn what they wish to learn when they wish to learn it, which is an unlearning approach. Because, even things like buying a house, it's been shown that if you do a controlled study, if you simply know enough math to, you've taken enough math to understand how mortgage rates work, you are far less likely to default on your mortgage. So, if we don't teach math because our child doesn't really like it, or we didn't like it ourselves, we're really doing a disservice for them. And again, for me, like I loved to read as a child. It was never a problem for me. So, but math, no, that was not something I wanted to do. But I think that as a child, it was important for me to be also being taught mathematics, because that way I could have flourished much more easily with all career doors open to me. A good education, in the standard disciplines is really valuable for society. And I think we see the results sometimes. I worked for 5 years in an inner urban school district. The kids were awesome. The education they got was horrific. These kids, many of them had never had a graded paper in their life. They couldn't add 5 plus 3. And then they come out into the world, and it's not their fault. They could be really good, but then they're making decisions about battery-powered vehicles and how to taxes and economic and financial decisions when they can't even add simple numbers together. This does not make for a well-informed society. So learning and education is really, really important for all students. And and this is part of what I'm trying to share, is just use some of these basic uncommon sense ideas, and you can really help many, many more students flourish, because so many have that aptitude, but it's being quashed by educational methods that sometimes can actually just hurt students' abilities to learn.
Somebody's asking, is there a way to quickly assess the size of a student's working memory so we can personalize teaching for their case, for their individual case?
Well, there is, but you have to be really careful with, it's kind of like, oh yeah, would it be good to have IQ tests for every student in your class? If you did that, what you would do is you'd end up focusing inadvertently on the high IQ ones, and then you're inadvertently kind of leaving the lower IQ. And actually, remember that IQ is actually a measure of how fast a learner you are, which is not necessarily the same as real, common sense intelligence. If someone really wanted to, they could take the Learn Like a Pro MOOC, and there's a very simple test on that MOOC so you can see what your working memory is. Mine is about 2 in the morning before I've had coffee, and when I've had coffee, it is perhaps 3. But the tendency of people is to say, is to game this test. So the test is you have 8 sentences read one by one aloud to you. And then you listen to the sentences, and your goal is to remember the last word in each sentence. So the next sentence comes on and it starts kind of overriding what you're trying to remember. And if you have a really good working memory, you can remember even up to 8. But people will tend to like make up a sentence that helps. They'll use all these little mnemonic tricks, so it artificially inflates. But if you really want a sense of what your own working memory capacity is, you can use that test. So Learn Like a Pro is on edX.
Thank you, Barb. And Nixon is asking, what is a question that changed or influenced your life for the better?
What is a question
that changed or influenced your life for the better?
Let's see. I can tell you exactly what that was. So I was coming back to the university. I was going to learn math and science. And I started learning, I was studying away. And, I found that, you remember how I talked about Mr. Fry and chemistry? I found out I actually loved chemistry. I mean, I just totally loved it. I took the first semester, it was just like, this is the be all and end all. Take the second semester, wow. And then I was planning to go over the summer and take more chemistry courses because I was just really falling in love with chemistry. And so I was out visiting my father. And my father never in his life, told me to do anything. Like I said, I'm going to enlist in the army and learn a language. He's like, oh, you'll learn a lot. So while I was visiting, I got a call from this company that was looking for Russian translators on Soviet trawlers. And I said, thanks. I'm going to study chemistry this summer. So no. So I hung up and I went out, and my father said, oh, who was that? And I said, oh, it's this company. They wanted me to go work on Soviet trawlers, but, I'd rather study chemistry. And he said, you what? You turned down a chance to go and work on Soviet trawlers? I mean, that's a pretty amazing experience. So I called him right back and said, I'm going to go work out on the trawlers. Is it okay? And I went out and have had far more adventures in my life. And of course, I worked out there, your liver could only take so much of working out with the Soviets. But then I went, worked for them for 2 fishing seasons. And at the end of the second one, I got a job offer to go work at the South Pole Station. So I went from the Bering Sea down all the way through Christchurch to the South Pole, and of course met my husband Philip. And so the rest is awesome history.
Yay. That's great, Barbara. Thank you. And what would be some words of advice that you would give to teachers, to new teachers or people who have been teaching for years? If you could only say one thing to them, what would that be? Okay, that's a ridiculous question. You can say more than one thing.
If it sounds too good to be true, it is. So a lot of what I've found in teaching is that very, very well-meaning approaches that seem to make things easier often hurt students' abilities to learn. Good teaching is not easy, and I think great teachers know it's not easy. So approaches like growth mindset, if we just teach our students to be open to the idea that they can change their brain and learn. That's such a simplistic approach. And of course, a proponent of growth mindset might say, oh, well, no, it's far more complicated than that. But actually, if you read Carol Dweck's book and so forth, and she herself has done studies that show that teaching students about growth mindset, that they can just actually change their brain and open their mind to learning, that they just haven't learned something yet. It really doesn't have a very big impact. I think that, these sort of real quick and easy fixes can be so seductive for teachers. But good teaching it's an art, and it requires a special kind of person. And I'm deeply in awe of all of you teachers, because I think that you are doing such an incredible service for all of us. And it's a really hard job, but it also can be a very fulfilling job. And I salute you, because I have learned so much from you.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you everyone for being here. And one thing that students often say when they come to workshops is, oh, I didn't know that my teachers really cared about me learning. And I'm like, yeah, they really care. They put in the work, and it's a ton of work to design a great class. And then it's also a ton of work to facilitate a great class. Even when you've designed a great class, or it happens to me when I think, oh, this would be great. And then facilitating it, it's also extra hard. It comes with extra levels of complexity. So thank you so much for being here today, and for asking great questions, and for thinking about how you can improve your teaching. And thank you so much for giving us, Barbara, the tools to improve our teaching, these uncommon sense tips. And we highly recommend the MOOC and the book. So thank you so much, and have a great day.